Next up, Roland Turner is going to be talking about beyond licensing, addressing the limits of the FOSS approach. Over to you, Roland Turner.
I am both Roland and Turner. It's okay. Good morning. So this talk has had a more difficult genesis than my talks of the last couple of years. The pattern has been sort of in about September to pick a topic and write a brief, and then in between times develop the ideas. This time round I bit off more than I could chew. I've had to toss like more than 2/3 of the content. What I'm going to be looking at is aimed at projects where FOSS is an excellent approach, if and only if it's done well. I'll get into who those are, but there's a whole category of projects where FOSS is unconditionally a great idea. I'm not going to talk about those. That's already a solved problem, not worth talking about. There's a whole category of activities where FOSS is a terrible idea. A lot of internal corporate or intra-corporate stuff doesn't actually make any sense at all to do FOSS. But there's an intermediate realm where FOSS is a good idea so long as we've thought through some of the problems. And the problems are getting very, very large. So it's becoming more and more important that we do this. So hopefully the resulting talk is mostly coherent. I was chopping stuff out as recently as 40 minutes ago, and hopefully I'll get through it in the remaining 23.5 minutes. The other big issue is I don't have solutions. I've got a bunch of things to look for, but the problems that remain on the table are not actually simple. If they were, they would have been solved some time ago. So it's more a sort of set of things to be thinking about, not a prescription for how to solve it. And as I said, I'm going to be working today only at the project level. There's also a bunch of stuff at the ecosystem level that just made the talk too big. So I've chopped all that out. Well, I'll mention it at the end, but I've mostly chopped it out. One of the big problems is open washing. Open source has become such a big deal that everyone wants to get on board, even if what they're doing really isn't terribly open and doesn't meet the kinds of things that we care about as open communities, and particularly the kinds of things that OSI cares about in certifying open licenses, or that FSF cares about in writing its free licenses. Some, but not all, open core business models just aren't realistically open. There's a continuous stream of license proposals that comes to OSI, which are improved or better for the community, which OSI looks at and goes, ha, no. They are usually about a for-profit business gaining control over contributors or preventing forks, neither of which is compatible with what open source is about. But there's the stakes are high, there's a lot of pressure for this to happen. The other big area is control despite FOSS licenses. This is an entire category of dysfunction by itself. Examples include adding terms of service that one way or another undermine the intent of the open source licenses, and with due respect to the Firefox folks, they really need to be thinking carefully about what they're doing and communicating it carefully. I can see that there might be a reason for them to have terms of service, but the way they've done it is catastrophically stupid. Conditional subscriptions are even worse. The legal picture is not yet clear, but it's at least conceivable that Red Hat has ended copyleft. The fact that Red Hat says, oh no, although the license is absolutely clear, the conditionality is clear in law as far as we're concerned, so long as we're making some upstream contributions on reasonable timeline that we say are probably the same things, we've complied, sue us. And so far as I can tell, no one has yet worked out how to. And in fact, the Software Freedom Conservancy has gotten as far as concluding that it's not yet possible. This is a very, very serious threat. It means that the foundations with billions or shortly hundreds of billions of dollars behind them may now have a tool with which to end copyleft. So the problems aren't small. The other big issue is essential services. So I'll go into a taxonomy shortly, but historically we thought about free software in the first instance as, oh, it's on an FTP server somewhere, or a CD, or perhaps even a BSD tape, for those who were around long enough to know about that. Distribution is now absolutely critical, and we've just apparently or reportedly seen WordPress violate that as part of an internal fight within the WordPress community, that real-time access was cut off to a section of the community, which, quite apart from any damage that it did, perhaps unjustly, to WP Engine, also disrupted the livings of thousands of people who are not part of the fight, who are being unjustly harmed. Finally, we keep seeing, in fact, the last few years, a rush of late switches to non-FOSS. I'm willing to believe that they are all reactive, that none were intentional rug pulls. But over and over again, corporations are stepping out saying, great, we're going to do everything open, and then 3 years down the track, they're like, oh, this is a terrible idea. We're going to stop. We've hired everyone who's active in the project, and they now take our orders in return for a paycheck, and we're just going to stop working on the open version of whatever it is, and if you happen to want to use the open version, well, that's your problem. The intrinsic problem is scale, or just a bigness. There are aspects that are coming up again and again in more and more projects where you need to wield resources that are infeasible or impossible for an individual to wield. And so it's unavoidable that you're working in some sort of institutional setting. The obvious examples that came to mind are the really big data sets. Wikipedia would not work if it was just download this thing off an FTP server. It works because it's an organization and a working editorial process in place to deal with all kinds of abuses. OpenStreetMap, similarly. The inputs to large language models are, in many cases, simply too large to be tractable. Quite apart from legalities and commercial interests, they're just enormous. There's a related problem is that a bunch of data is non-public. This is not quite bigness, but it's an adjacent issue that says if we're wanting to train AI models on medical data, we cannot publish it. Nonetheless, the work is valuable, the outputs are valuable, and all of the other components can reasonably be open source. And so there's Harish has put forward a great idea earlier this morning about sort of renaming the OSI's AI definition as the lesser AI definition, and then producing a version 2 that says, if you want to be recognized as a full open source AI, you must be working on open data. And so it's the same idea as GPL and LGPL. It's not that you can't do it or that it's wrong, but it should be clear to everyone that there's a difference between open AIs that are where all the inputs are open and AIs that are reasonably considered open but can't use open data. Costly iteration is the next issue, quite apart from the sheer size of inputs to large language models. In some cases, you're talking about millions of dollars of compute time to run one iteration of training the model, training the weights. You have similar problems with open hardware that rely upon mass manufacturing. If you've got stuff you can do on a 3D printer, that's great. But if you're talking about things like open laptops or open phones, they're not quantity 1. They're quantity 1,000 or 10,000. And so that means that the cost of iteration is very, very high and much beyond the reach of individuals or even most organizations. Vulnerability detection and response. This is a critical issue for anything that's internet connected. It's something that open communities are getting better at, and the OpenSSF is doing really good work to help get us all better at it, but it costs resources. And this is what's motivating Red Hat and others to sort of, hey, can we make a sustainable, economically sustainable business here without going too far outside the lines? Another one that we've sort of overlooked, but it's kind of sneaked up on us over the last couple of decades, the size of source code generally. Quick show of hands. How many people in this room have personally characterized, diagnosed, or repaired a bug in any of the kernels, any of the browsers, any of the desktop productivity suites, any of the large software that are out there, around? Okay, we've got myself plus one. More than one of those? More than one of those categories? Oh, okay, wow, okay. It's rare. The amount of code that we rely on is so gigantic that although it's open source in the sense that a community has access and anyone can choose to specialize, as individuals, we are beholden to the efforts of others to customize and to protect. We simply can't do it ourselves in the way that we could 30 years ago with stuff that would fit in less than 1 million lines of code. Personal data, again, coming up in AI cases, there are governance, risk management and compliance issues that are either infeasible for an individual or in some cases are legally impossible for an individual to meet. Nonetheless, they're important, again, particularly in training AI. And finally, authenticity, particularly the management of trademarks. This comes up a lot for open hardware where it's done really badly and you end up with very unfortunate dysfunctions where it's extremely difficult for people who are not part of the teams that are making the things to work out which thing on AliExpress is in fact made the way that the open designer claims it's made. So and this is because trademark law is difficult, or at least overlooked. The other, unfortunately, is internal to our community, and that's a sort of unreasonable optimism about what FOSS can and can't achieve. And so, okay, we have the OSI approved hammers, everything is a nail that we're going to, and like, not everything is. Less now, but certainly historically, there was a sort of puritanical approach that says if you're promoting, including FOSSASIA, we hit this with requiring Google accounts to submit talk proposals 5 years ago. Okay, we were wrong on that one. But the tendency to sort of say everything FOSS is good, therefore everything non-FOSS is unacceptable, leads to really bad choices. And worse, provides space for rent seekers to exploit. If you can't see where the edge is, if you're dealing with a simplified model, then it becomes much easier for for-profit corporations to present disingenuous pictures about what they're doing in order to motivate behavior. So I don't wish to beat on my own community too hard, other than to say that it does matter what the expectations are, and that we understand what it is we think we're achieving, and particularly that the 2 or 3 groups of free and open source objectives are distinct. They're not the same. The big problem, however, is society at large. We are not in the situation that we were in 30 years ago. It is no longer hobbies or academia. Our stuff now directly affects the lives of at least 6 billion people, and arguably 8. Realistically, even of the 6 billion, less than 0.5% can program a computer. There's a 200 to 1 disparity there in the decisions that we are making that affect everyone. And in reality, a bunch of our decisions are affected by an even smaller number of people who have enough money and power to control the decision-making of the corporations that employ most programmers. I thought about doing a pie chart, but this is like 1/100th of a pixel wide. The disparity is incredible. To ignore this, to fail to deal with it, to fail to take reasonably the needs of at least 6 billion other stakeholders is unconscionable. We're letting it be done to us. We're helping what US politicians are finally publicly acknowledging is oligarchy. We can't keep walking past this. One of the, this is last point's a bit out of scope for this, other than to sort of help make the picture clear. Sometimes within our communities we think, well, hey, I've got access to the code, I can modify what's on my computer, I don't have to worry about Facebook, I can self-host my stuff. This is not addressing the problem. It's not enough, it's not even close. Software freedom is meaningless unless it advances human freedom. We are not defenseless. This is a Levy diagram from Wikipedia, and there are many interesting details about how we defend ourselves against floods. The difficulty is that the guys with the money can raise the water as high as they like. Our defenses have to adapt. It requires continuous diligence. Slides out of order. Ben Franklin famously said that the first Congress had produced a republic if you can keep it. And we're in the same situation. This one's ours to lose. We're here, we built all this stuff, we risk allowing it to be dragged into a means of oppression far beyond anything that's ever existed. The good news is that for the money to do this kind of damage, there needs to be a yield. That means they're focused here, the top 1,000 projects. But there's an awful lot of value and an awful lot of room for resistance in the next 100,000 projects. So it's by no means hopeless. Serious, but not hopeless. Taking a bit of a look at the landscape, self-service licensing has been a world-changing idea. An idea from yesterday's privacy and security track from, I think it was Georg Kriver talking about self-sovereign identity in Swiss healthcare. Paper remains important, physical paper, critically because it's peer-to-peer. If you and I agree a thing, we can write it down and sign 2 copies and keep one each, and voila, an agreement has been created and it's enforceable, but we don't need an intermediary. That remains an incredibly powerful capability. And in fact, thanks, the free and open source software relies on exactly the same thing. It's less obvious now, but when it was sort of FTP servers and CDs, someone you've never met who has a copy of your software can legally share it with somebody else who you've also never met and will never hear of, and still be bound by the terms of the license. Copyleft is an even more extraordinary idea. It's sort of that sort of independent peer-to-peer operation with a freedom-preserving conditionality built into the license. One can't help looking at those two things and ask, well, are there some more? Can we pull additional rabbits out of this hat? Not yet. Hopefully, but I can't see any yet. I'd also point out that there's a spectrum of relationships between developers or developer projects and other developers and the public and users. Historically, there was code on FTP servers and CDs and even the open reel tapes. There was even a blog post by the FSF years ago that I couldn't find, musing about how important it was or wasn't for a project to have a website. It was an innovation at one point. We now sort of take for granted mailing lists, hosted code repositories, issue tracking, even DevOps pipelines, the sorts of stuff that GitHub and others provide. Increasingly, projects have vulnerability disclosure points of contact, rapid response, and the upstream and downstream partnerships to make sure that fixes get propagated fast. Because the longer a fix is, the longer a problem is in the wild, the more likely it is to be exploited. But worse, the longer a partial fix is in the wild, the greater advantage that's handed to criminals. Because the fixes themselves signal where to look for the next set of vulnerabilities. Open source adjacent, and even more sort of organizationally involved relationship is the idea of a data commons or data stewardship. I won't get into this too deeply other than to point out that, again, with respect to personal data or large data sets with copyright or indigenous knowledge limits on them, these are data sets that can't be published. Nonetheless, there are ways to have broad collaboration. And so there's another set of relationships that might exist. In terms of what solutions there are, it's looking increasingly unavoidable that legal personhood is a requirement. Whether it's a trust or a 501(c) or a foundation or any of like a dozen other structures that are used, it needs to be able to own stuff. There's got to be some governance mechanism whose decision-making can be sort of compelled to some extent to be for the public benefit. Certainly for the large iterative cost cases, decision-making about when to spend the money to train an LM or to spin a hardware manufacturing run. There is as yet no consensus on criteria, although I'm going to point to some of it. The big problem here is that reliable auditing is infeasible. Even if we get to consensus on what the criteria are, I think the sort of analogous to the free software and open source definitions, organizations are run by people who are in the habit of lying and in need of capturing auditors. Auditing is expensive and risks capture. So it's by no means a perfect successor to self-service licensing and copyleft. But I'm starting to think we can't avoid it. At the very least, the organization needs to own code, data, or have access rights, trademarks to deal with the authenticity problems and trust anchor problems, domain names likewise. The primary distribution mechanism matters, and especially because you've got to be able to get security fixes out fast to network-connected devices. And in many cases, there are additional cloud services that matter. Again, talking about Swiss healthcare yesterday, the thing was built on IPFS. Well, yes, you can use the public instances, but you won't get adequate properties for the intended use case. So for his particular project, that means hosting your own IPFS network. Variants of this will come up in different ways for different projects, but I suspect that it's going to become more and more common. And now I'm worried about time. People have talked about Ulysses Pacts. The FOSS licenses themselves are a Ulysses Pact. This is you bind yourself in advance so that if you do something bad later, others can stop you or can recover. That's Ulysses lashing himself to the mast so he didn't succumb to the sirens. In telcos, it's number portability. Cory Doctorow has talked at some length about the analogous capabilities in social media, Blue Sky being the case he's looking at. He talks about building the fire exits from the outset and then actively fostering competitive networks so that if you are later captured by VCs, there's a way for your users to escape. But it's worth being aware that bureaucracy costs agility. The more of it you have, the slower you can move. Workable poison pills, not sure. This is a strategy that's used occasionally to slow or stop hostile takeovers in listed companies. Various kinds of, if the boss does this bad thing, then outsiders are empowered to intervene. I can't yet give workable examples, and I'm a little bit concerned about making sure that whoever gets to intervene is less abusive than the incumbent, because once you create that sort of mechanism, bad guys can use it too, but I think it's an area of research. Zomia strategies, I've developed this idea even less. There's a chunk of Southeast Asia where state development has essentially failed, and here you've got entire societies who are actively choosing to do things specifically to frustrate the development of states, and this is particularly in mountain ranges. On plains, it's too easy, but mountains are expensive. I won't go too deeply into that other than to say there's a whole body of research into this method of making life hard for billionaires to get control. Perhaps more practically is RFC 9620, which calls for performing human rights reviews or human rights impact assessments during protocol development and gives an actual checklist of things to evaluate. I'd suggest that this probably applies somewhere early in the governance of an open source project. Think through these consequences. And if you haven't addressed, if there are problems that you can address that you haven't, address them early. That, I think, is the single most practical thing I can point out today. It's also worth noting that this sits in the context of border activism. It's Lawrence Lessig who pointed out that to think about it as norms, laws, codes, and markets, and again, Cory Doctorow has expanded this at some length. As coders, we tend to sort of jam ourselves in trying to think about everything as code, but actually there's a bunch of other ways to intervene, and it's worth our while to develop them. I won't spend much time on them because it's outside of an individual project, but just to bear in mind that there are other ways to address these problems. There's a whole bunch of other places to look, which I won't get into today, except to say that if you are interested in or at all capable of engaging with standards development organizations, please go and talk to the IO Foundation guys today. They're here. They are tackling the problem of large corporate interests capturing standards development in IETF, in ISO, in all of those places. The rest I'll leave for those who wish to read my slides later, because I really am out of time. All I would point out is that the stakes are gigantic. Our work is harming people in the billions. We can't walk past this. Worse, the pressure to concentrate control points is going to go up and up and up. Foundations are a solution, but the foundations are themselves a risk. And the incentives to betray are accumulating continuously, and they will continue to. They won't stop. So, oops, I should have left Red Hat's name out, but never mind. Errors may be unfixable. Depending on what actually happens with what Red Hat is doing to frustrate GPL, it may be the point that it may actually be now the case the copyleft is dead. So it's also not the case that we can wait until after we can see the problem. Or rather, we can, but then we may incur unbelievable losses. So there's a need to be a bit proactive. Hopefully that trimmed form of the thing fitted the time and made some sense. Questions?
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
You have microphones? Or?
Okay. Hello. What do you think about the dual licensing approach used by, for example, Qt, where they have commercial license and also release under LGPL?
In 1997, 1998, it was I who proposed this approach to Mozilla. It's why Firefox, well, Mozilla and then Firefox under NPL was both something that Netscape could exploit commercially, but also had enough openness to allow the broader open source community to use it well. We've learned a bit since then. As I mentioned the difficulty with open core. Some open core models are great, some are not. And I don't yet have a way to write down what the criteria are, but it's a sort of case-by-case analysis, that in some cases it makes real sense to say, yes, this core or baseline thing that's useful to the open community is good, that's fabulous, and the thing that's being sold for money on top is a clearly distinct use case and a perfectly reasonable thing for a corporate sponsor to do. In other cases, not so much. But yeah, this is an area where I feel it would be appropriate to start developing consensus on where the edges are. Because you're right, that's a really common case where the lines that are deliberately blurred and the risk of what would be an open project getting itself captured by rent seekers is very significant. So it's I think, a necessary mechanism, but I think we need to develop better our understanding of when to use it.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi. So you mentioned like 100 different problems, but one is, the fact that I mean, I wanted to focus on the fact that companies sometimes have switch back to an open license or try to find other ways to force people to pay or to monetize the code. And what I see is that the pressure for this is often not from the company leadership, the CEOs that take it's from the funders. So you start a company, you grow, you get investors, you get venture capitals, and you care about open source, but the venture capitals don't. After a while they say, no, you're just making 5% margin, we want 30% margin, so just find a way to give us margin, we don't care, or lay off your people. And so the problem is how we can get, let's say, ethical funding sources, or funders that accept the fact that maybe the margins will be lower, but they are funding something useful for the collective.
Thank you, and I accept that completely. Coming up with better ways to fund than the default, hey, let the VCs pay us and then hope they don't come back and demand their share, is proving to be a really bad model. So sure, finding better ways to do it. I agree.
And it's very interesting, isn't it? Because, like, for example, with the cryptocurrencies, right? There was an attempt, right, to solve this problem, and it hasn't quite worked out yet.
I very carefully didn't talk about cryptocurrencies, about the capture of Kickstarter on the promise of cryptocurrencies, about the imagined use of DAOs as a solution to all of these problems. You can make your organization just program solutions. Like, no, you can't. You actually make a machine that's easier to capture if you do that. So I hear you. Yes. I'm not yet convinced.
Yeah, no. So I'm no. What I'm saying is that there was an attempt. It didn't seem to work out. We still haven't really found that right model, right? It's going to be quite a work in progress. Right?
Yeah, and we're back to why I put strike out through solutions. I don't have the solutions yet.
And,
Sorry? It's work in progress, absolutely. Yeah.
Or we can do it, like old school style in Asia, where we see copyright as merely an abstraction and not a very relevant one, and we can just go around copying everything and call it a day.
That's certainly a different variant of my idea that we shouldn't treat everything as a copyright problem. And that solution has some value. Bunny has dealt with this at length in open hardware, where we're like, the spec sheets are prohibited, and fine.
I remember back in the day, one of the ways that a local company was solving this problem, they issued a software, but then it was a software that was actually embedded into a ISA card, and you had to plug in the card in order to activate the software, and that was quite.
Dongles with the...
yes, but the USB makes it too easy, right? This is like good old ISA cards.
Screwdriver
Yes. So it's like fascinating.
Many tools. Hopefully we can find ways to use them to benefit our communities and the population of the world rather than harm them.
Hopefully. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.